"You really have to watch out for my dad," Jason said, laughing as he tossed a towel over his shoulder. "He can be intense." Those words echoed in my mind as I stood in Jason's living room, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and unease. Jason was my best friend, the one person I trusted with everything, well, almost everything. What he didn't know was that I'd been harboring a secret for years, one I barely admitted to myself. I was attracted to men, and now, standing here in his house, meeting his father for the first time, I felt that secret clawing its way to the surface. Jason's dad, Marcus, was nothing like I expected. In his mid-40s, he had a commanding presence, broad shoulders, sharp jawline, and piercing hazel eyes that seemed to read people with unsettling ease. He wasn't just attractive, he was magnetic. There was a calm confidence about him, the kind that made you feel both at ease and on edge, all at once. "Welcome to our humble abode," Marcus said, shaking my hand firmly as we arrived. His smile was warm, but his gaze lingered a little longer than necessary, making my stomach twist. I laughed nervously. "Thanks for having me, Mr. Carter. Call me Marcus," he said with a wink, his grip tightening just slightly before he let go. The weekend was supposed to be a relaxing escape, just Jason and me hanging out, watching movies, and playing video games like we always did. But Marcus's presence added an unexpected layer of tension. Every interaction felt charged, like there was an unspoken game being played, though I couldn't quite put my finger on the rules. That first night, as we sat around the dinner table, I couldn't help but notice the subtle ways Marcus drew me into conversation. He asked about my studies, my interests, and my plans for the future, his tone always casual but his eyes sharp, as if he were cataloging every detail. "Your parents must be proud of you," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair and studying me. I hesitated. "They are, I think. We don't talk much about feelings." Marcus nodded knowingly, his expression softening. "It's not always easy to open up, is it?" Jason, oblivious to the undercurrent, interjected with a joke, and the conversation shifted. But the way Marcus looked at me lingered in my mind long after dinner ended. The next day, Jason suggested we go swimming. Their backyard had a beautiful pool, and the warm weather made it impossible to resist. We splashed around, laughing and joking like we always did. For a while, I forgot about everything else. But when we returned to the house, dripping wet and shivering, the dynamic shifted again. Jason ran upstairs to grab dry clothes, leaving me alone with Marcus. "You boys have fun?" Marcus asked, leaning casually against the kitchen counter. "Yeah, it was great," I said, grabbing a towel to dry my hair. His gaze flicked to my chest for the briefest moment before he looked away, his expression unreadable. "Good. You should enjoy yourself while you're young. Time has a way of slipping by before you even realize it." I nodded, unsure how to respond, and quickly excused myself to change. The guest room was cozy, with a large window overlooking the backyard. I closed the door behind me and peeled off my wet shirt, the cool air raising goosebumps on my skin. As I rummaged through my bag for a fresh outfit, I heard the door creak open. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. Turning slowly, I saw Marcus standing in the doorway, his expression apologetic. "Sorry, I didn't realize you were..." He trailed off, his eyes briefly meeting mine before flickering downward. "It's fine," I said quickly, grabbing a shirt to cover myself. But instead of leaving, he lingered for a moment longer than necessary. "You've grown up quite a bit since Jason first mentioned you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. I didn't know how to respond. My cheeks burned as I stammered out a response, something about how people tend to grow up over time. But Marcus just smiled. "I'll let you finish," he said, stepping back and closing the door behind him. As I stood there, shirt clutched in my hands, a wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Embarrassment, confusion, and a flicker of something I wasn't ready to name. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a line had been drawn in the sand and then quietly crossed. And as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if Jason's warning had been about more than just his dad's personality. I couldn't have known then how much that weekend would change everything. "You've been quiet tonight," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, as he leaned against the doorframe. It was late, and the house was silent. Jason had gone to bed hours ago, leaving me alone in the living room, half watching a movie I didn't care about. I looked up from the couch, startled by Marcus's presence. He was dressed in a casual t-shirt and sweatpants, but he still carried that air of confidence that made me feel both drawn to and wary of him. "I guess I'm just tired," I replied, my voice faltering slightly. Marcus stepped into the room, his movements unhurried, like a predator who had all the time in the world. He sat down in the armchair across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. Tired or distracted? The question hung in the air, and I felt the weight of his gaze pressing on me. My stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and dread. He knew, or at least he suspected. "I don't know what you mean," I said, forcing a smile and looking back at the screen. "You're a terrible liar, you know that?" Marcus's tone was light, almost playful, but there was an edge to it that made my heart race. I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly hyper-aware of how small the room felt. "I'm not lying," I said, my voice quieter now. Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Sam. I'm not going to hurt you." It was such an odd thing to say, and yet it struck a chord deep within me. Was fear the right word for what I was feeling? I wasn't sure. All I knew was that Marcus's presence had a gravitational pull I couldn't resist, no matter how hard I tried. The silence between us grew heavier, charged with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Finally, Marcus spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You remind me of myself when I was your age." I frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly, his eyes distant, as if he were looking at something or someone only he could see. "I spent a lot of years pretending to be someone I wasn't, hiding parts of myself because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. It's exhausting, isn't it?" I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. How much had he guessed? How much was I giving away without even realizing it? Before I could find the words, Marcus stood up and moved to sit next to me on the couch. The proximity made my pulse quicken, but I didn't move. I couldn't. "You don't have to answer that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just want you to know that you don't have to hide around me." The vulnerability in his words caught me off guard. For a moment, I saw not the confident, composed man who intimidated me, but someone who had fought his own battles and carried his own scars. "Marcus," I started, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his eyes searching mine. His words trailed off, and in the quiet that followed, the unspoken seemed louder than anything else. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. I knew this was wrong. I knew I should pull away, say something, do anything to stop this from going further. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I let myself lean into the moment, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His hand lingered on mine, and when he finally looked at me again, his expression was one of cautious hope. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," Marcus said, his voice soft but steady. "You're not," I whispered, surprising even myself. The admission hung between us, fragile but unbreakable. Marcus leaned closer, his face mere inches from mine. For a moment, I thought he might kiss me, but he hesitated, his breath warm against my skin. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely audible. I couldn't. Instead, I closed the gap between us, and the world seemed to fall away. When it was over, the weight of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy blanket. Marcus pulled back slightly, his expression unreadable. "This doesn't have to mean anything you're not ready for," he said quietly. But it did mean something. It meant everything, And as I sat there, still trying to catch my breath, I realized there was no going back. "You're different this morning," Jason said, laughing as he tossed a piece of toast onto my plate. "What happened, Sam? Sleep badly?" I forced a chuckle, my stomach nodding. Across the table, Marcus sat sipping his coffee, the picture of calm. His eyes met mine for a fleeting second, and I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on my breakfast. The previous night felt like a fever dream, one I couldn't shake. The weight of what had happened pressed on me with every passing second, an overwhelming mixture of shame, guilt, and exhilaration. Jason was right. I was different this morning. How could I not be? "Just didn't sleep much," I mumbled, avoiding Jason's playful gaze. "Probably all those late-night horror movies." Marcus chimed in smoothly, his tone so casual it almost convinced me he wasn't carrying the same burden. Almost. But I knew better. I could feel it in the way he carried himself, in the brief pauses between his words. He felt it too. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jason and I played video games, went for a run, and joked around like we always did, but I wasn't really there. My thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus, to his touch, his words, his steady gaze that seemed to see straight through me. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I shouldn't have let it happen. And yet, every time I tried to bury the memory, it resurfaced with vivid clarity. The warmth of his hand on mine, the way he whispered my name, the quiet understanding in his eyes, it all lingered, haunting me. That evening, I found myself alone in the kitchen, washing dishes while Jason was upstairs. I barely noticed when Marcus walked in until he spoke. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice low enough that it didn't carry beyond the room. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. "I'm fine," I said, not turning around. "Sam," he said softly, and the way he said my name made my resolve waver. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What are we doing, Marcus?" He leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know last night was meaningless." The raw honesty in his words cut through me. "It doesn't change the fact that it was wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Maybe it was," he said, stepping closer, "but I can't bring myself to regret it." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I felt the same, despite everything. The betrayal of Jason's trust, the moral weight of what we'd done. I couldn't regret it either. Later that night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. What would happen if Jason ever found out? Could I even look him in the eye after this weekend? And yet, beneath the guilt and fear, there was something else. A strange sense of freedom. For years, I'd suppressed who I was, terrified of what people might think, of how my life might change if the truth came out. But with Marcus, I didn't have to pretend. For the first time, I felt truly seen. It wasn't love, not in the conventional sense, but it was something that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. As the hours ticked by, I made a decision. When the weekend was over, I'd leave this house and put as much distance between me and Marcus as possible. But I wouldn't run from the truth anymore. What happened between us had shown me a part of myself I could no longer ignore. The next morning, as Jason loaded my bags into the car, Marcus stood in the doorway, watching. I avoided his gaze, unsure of how to say goodbye. "Take care of yourself, Sam," he said, his voice steady but laced with meaning. "You too," I replied, forcing a smile. As we drove away, Jason rambled on about plans for the next weekend, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. I nodded along, offering half-hearted responses, but my mind was miles away. That weekend left a mark on me, one I knew would never fade completely. It was a moment of weakness, of selfish desire, but it was also a turning point. In the weeks that followed, I began to confront the parts of myself I'd kept hidden for so long. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living a lie. What happened with Marcus was forbidden, and maybe it always would be. But in that forbidden moment, I found something I hadn't even realized I was searching for, a glimpse of who I truly was.